There are places on Earth where silence seems to hold memories of other worlds. Nazca is one of those places, a desert so vast and still that time itself seems hesitate before crossing it. There, among burnt rocks and winds that never change direction, giant figures rest engraved on the ground like luminous scars. Birds, spirals, warriors, serpents that only heaven can fully understand. Who drew these lines? And above all, for whom? Some say they were messages to the gods. Others, astronomical. Maps, rituals of fertility, sacred pilgrimage routes. But there are those who feel it, when flying over those shapes that only make sense seen from above, that there is something more there, something that surpasses human understanding. A call that echoes from the desert to the stars. Nazca doesn't scream. She whispers, and his whisper is too old to fit into history alone. He speaks of a humanity that, before knowing how to read the sky with telescopes, was already reading it with the soul. From a people who walk the earth as if writing an invisible prayer, destined for eyes that might never land here below. Each line is a question, each figure, a mirror, and when the wind sweeps across those golden plains, it's as if the planet itself breathed, reminding us that we too, however modern we may be, still we seek what they sought, meaning, connection, transcendence. Imagine yourself there, in silence, between heat and emptiness. Around you the horizon vibrates like an eternal mirage. Above, the dark blue sky seems like a window open to infinity. And beneath your feet, millennia of mystery drawn with a precision that defies the chance. No one knows exactly when it started, nor why it ended. But one thing is certain, something in that soil is still alive. A stone code that resists to time, wind, and oblivion. Maybe the Nazca lines weren't meant to be seen by the eyes, but remembered by the soul, as if they were a bridge between worlds, an attempt at dialogue between earth and heaven, between the human and the divine. And if you feel like certain things are no coincidence, maybe this video is exactly what you needed to hear. Because sometimes, the mystery isn't in what we see from above, but in what the desert tries to do. Reveal us from within. When explorer Toribio Mejia Gespe first saw those lines in the desert in 1927, he had no idea that he was faced with one of the greatest Enigma's archaeological sites on the planet. Seen from the ground, they appeared to be mere formless traces. But when planes began to fly over Nazca, the landscape transformed. What was before dust and stone turned out to be an immense map drawn with geometric perfection, figures that only gained meaning when seen from a perspective impossible for the eyes humans of the time. More than 800 straight lines, 300 geometric figures, and 70 drawings of animals and plants. The monkey, the spider, the hummingbird, the whale, the condor, all recorded in an area of almost 500 square kilometers, traced millimeter by millimeter over the arid surface of Peru, as if someone, thousands of years ago, had used the desert itself as a canvas, and the wind as guardian. The Nazca civilization flourished between the 2nd century BC and 7th century AD, in one of the most inhospitable areas of the planet. And paradoxically, it was precisely there, where nothing grows, where it almost never rains, where silence dominates, that human beings decided to design the invisible. The absence of rain preserved the lines almost intact for 2 millennia. The dark surface stones, when removed, revealed the lighter soil beneath. This natural contrast was enough for the desert to become an eternal parchment. Scientists have tried to understand the purpose. It would have been a collective art form, a offering to the fertility deities, or a gigantic astronomical observatory. Where did each line align with the movement of the stars and the sun? In 1941, German astronomer Paul Kossak called the lines the greatest book of astronomy of the world. At sunset on the winter solstice, he noticed that one of the lines pointed exactly to the point where the sun set on the horizon. From there, his disciple, Maria Reich, dedicated her life to studying the Enigma, calculated angles, measured distances, and concluded that those lines could form a gigantic celestial calendar, a bridge between human time and the time of the constellations. But Reike also spoke of beauty and devotion. For her, the Nazca people did not draw lines just to measure the sky, but to dialogue with him. Each figure would be a prayer, an offering to guarantee rain, harvest, and balance. The condor, symbol of the ascending spirit. The monkey, the cycle of creation. O hummingbird, messenger between worlds. Maybe art and faith were the same thing, and there is a detail that few people notice. To draw figures of up to 300 meters, the Nazca needed an organization impeccable, exact calculations and mastery of scale. With ropes, stakes, and almost modern precision, they traced proportions that remain accurate to this day. Archaeologist Johann Reinhard observed that the perfection of lines reveals not only technical knowledge but also spiritual purpose. He described Nazca as a map of the invisible, a form of prayer done with the feet. Perhaps the desert was the altar, maybe heaven, the temple, and perhaps each step, each stone moved, was a form of ritual, a gesture of communion between humanity and the cosmos. Still, the mystery persists. Why make such huge drawings, if almost no one could you see them completely from the ground? Were they destined for the gods? Or maybe to something, or someone, who flew over the earth? Nazca doesn't respond. She just returns the look, and it is in this silence that its strength lies. Because more than an archaeological enigma, those lines are a reminder. Human beings have always wanted to be understood by others, infinite. The earth that speaks to the sky is perhaps the very reflection of the soul that tries to be heard. If something inside you feels that these traits hide more than stone and sand, stay until the end. The answer may be here, or perhaps above us where wind and mystery meet. Find. For decades, archaeologists, astronomers, and mystics have tried to decipher the code hidden beneath the Nazca wind, and the more they studied, the more the mystery deepened. The lines did not seem to follow a single pattern. Some pointed to solstices, others followed directions without apparent logic, and many intertwined as if formed a gigantic symbolic labyrinth. What did the Nazca mean? And, even more so, who were they speaking to? The most accepted hypothesis among scientists proposes that the figures were created as part of sacred rituals to invoke rain. The Nazca Desert is one of the driest places on the planet, receiving less than 2 millimeters of precipitation per year. There, water is synonymous with life and miracles. Recent studies by archaeologists such as Johann Reinhard and Marcos Ponce show that many lines lead to ancient underground aqueducts, the Puquios, systems complexes of spiral canals that brought water from the mountains to the valleys. Thus, the figures perhaps represented not just art, but geographic prayer. The soil drew the faith of an entire people. Other scholars see astronomical language in the lines. The long, straight lines could function as solar markers observing the sunrise and sunset, star setting at certain times of the year. For agricultural civilizations, understanding celestial cycles was vital. Knowing when to sow, when to reap, when to be grateful. Heaven was the calendar and the temple at the same time. Archaeoastronomer Anthony Avani showed that many lines coincide with positions of specific celestial bodies, suggesting that the Nazca possessed an empirical science disguised as faith. But the truth is that, between science and the sacred, the border is thin. For ancient people, measuring the sky was an act of worship. When a Nazca drew a 15-kilometer straight line pointing toward the horizon, he wasn't making a calculation. He was making a vote. It was a promise drawn between the earth and the firmament, as if to say, we are here. We still remember the pact between dust and light. This fusion between technique and transcendence reveals something essential about the human spirit, the desire to perpetuate the invisible. Nazca was perhaps the first silent cry that art is a form of prayer. The same impulses that today lead us to science, religion, and poetry already existed there, translated into lines that defied erosion and oblivion. And that's why perhaps the figures continue to live, because they weren't created just for the eyes but for time. However, there are enigmas that challenge even the most skeptical. How can we explain the level of geometric precision without modern instruments? How to maintain the perfect scale of a drawing that can only be understood from the side tall? Maria Reiche used simple ropes and stakes to prove that it was possible, but admitted, still, there is something inexplicable about the perfection of these forms. It is as if someone had guided his hands from above. Was it just a metaphor? Or intuition? Some geologists suggest that the figures were traced over centuries, by generations successive. Others claim that they were made in a few decades with a single and coordinated purpose. In any case, they reveal a civilization of enormous sensitivity, capable of uniting mathematics, art, and spirituality in the same gesture. The Nazca did not paint the world. They revealed it. Maybe that's what still fascinates us, the feeling that lines don't belong totally into this world. They seem to belong somewhere in between the human and the divine, between the ground and sky, as if the creators had understood something that we have forgotten, that the true knowledge is born when science and spirit dance to the same beat. And then the question arises that no one can shut up. What if those lines weren't just art, but messages? Messages sent not to the abstract sky of faith, but to concrete eyes that one day came, and perhaps they promised to return. The wind passes, the desert responds with silence, but within this silence, there is an echo that does not die, a call that crosses the centuries and seems to say, "Look, again." Not everything earthly was born of the earth. There is a moment, when flying over Nazca, when the human mind gets lost between two certainties, that it is the work of earthly hands, and that it seems impossible that just be that, because there is something cosmic in the geometry of the lines, as if a celestial thought had materialized on the sand. This is where the mystery expands, and the questions become bigger than any response. Since the first flybys in the mid-20th century, scholars and visionaries raised hypotheses that defy common logic. Among them, Erich von Däniken, author of Were the Gods Astronauts, suggested that the Nazca lines could have been landing strips for visitors from other worlds. A controversial theory, of course, but also deeply symbolic, because deep down it expresses an ancient intuition that we are not alone, and that perhaps contact with the divine has always occurred through a form of science that we still don't understand. The Nazca figures are too vast to serve banal purposes. Some straight stretch for miles with near-perfect alignments to the North Magnetic. Others connect specific symbols, the hummingbird, the tree, the trapezoid, as if followed an energetic or astronomical logic. Researchers at Yamagata University in Japan analyzed hundreds of images by satellite and discovered that many figures are grouped according to constellations ancient visible 2,000 years ago. Were maps of the sky drawn on Earth? Or symbolic routes so that the messengers of the stars could find the way back? Ancient Andean cultures spoke of luminous beings coming from the heavens. The Paracas, predecessors of the Nazca, carved humanoid figures with helmets, large eyes, and elongated bodies. In caves in the region there are murals that depict entities descending from the firmament, surrounded by rays. For shamans, they were wind gods, messengers from invisible worlds. For us, perhaps, echoes of something that human memory, transformed into myth. But what if the myth is just the poetic way of recording what the eyes couldn't explain? There's also a curious detail. Some figures resemble electrical circuits, spirals, and forms of energy in motion. The Nazca monkey, with its geometric body and spiral tail, was described by engineers as a possible wave diagram. Could it be a coincidence? Perhaps. But chance rarely designs with such symmetry. Ancient people observed the firmament as if listening to a voice. They knew that the sky was not just a ceiling but a mirror, and if the earth mirrors the sky, what we see in Nazca could be just that, a reflection-inverted image of the constellations, an invitation to remember where we came from. The condor, for example, coincides with the swan constellation, the monkey with the bear minor, the hummingbird with Venus, the morning and afternoon star, symbol of the crossing between worlds. The Nazca perhaps felt that there was communication beyond words, that art could be an antenna, and that the desert, silent and eternal, would be the perfect transmitter. Whoever the recipient is, gods, ancestors, cosmic travelers, or time itself, the message seems clear. See, we exist. We remember. But the mystery does not require belief, it invites contemplation. Because even if the lines weren't made for ships, they are still portals, not of metal and light, but of consciousness. They remind us that human beings have always raised their eyes upward in search of meaning, and that perhaps the oldest contact with the cosmos was internal, spiritual. The real landing, after all, happens in the soul, And yet something inside us insists on dreaming of heaven, with the possibility that one day someone actually came down, not to dominate but to teach. Perhaps the lines are not clues but answers, answers left for a future humanity, which is only now beginning to remember what forgot. If something awakens in you when you hear these stories, if a silent part misses a time it didn't live, stay until the end. Because sometimes the questions we ask the universe are exactly the same ones we ask the universe does to us. Perhaps the biggest secret of Nazca is not in the lines, but in the eyes of those who line them. Contemplate. Because every line drawn in the desert seems to speak less about distant gods and more about us, about the deep need that human beings have to signify what invisible. The Nazca figures can be seen as gigantic mandalas, expressions archetypal of a collective soul. Carl Jung said that symbols are the bridges that connect the conscious to the unconscious, the man to what he feels, but cannot name. And what are those lines if not symbols on a cosmic scale? When the hummingbird spreads its wings over the sand, it doesn't just represent a bird, represents the soul that seeks the nectar of light. When the monkey traces spirals with its tail, it recalls the eternal cycle of creation and return. The condor, which rises in silent flight, is the spirit that detaches itself from matter to touch infinity. The Nazca perhaps didn't want to build anything to last, just leave a memory of what it means to be human, to dream of the high despite living in the dust. Each figure is a collective confession engraved on the ground: fear of drought, gratitude for the sun, desire to understand the mystery. It is art, but it is also prayer, science, and memory. A testimony to what Jung would call the planetary unconscious, a language universal that speaks through symbols that we all recognize even without a translator. Ultimately, what Nazca shows us is that the human spirit is geometric. He seeks alignment between body and soul, between earth and sky, between what we are and what we remember having been. Those lines are not random. They reveal an emotional and spiritual intelligence that transcends logic. Ancient people perhaps understood something we have forgotten, that art is the science of the soul, and that each drawn form is an attempt to translate the unspeakable. When Maria Reich spent days alone in the desert, measuring every line under the sun inclement, he said he felt like the ground was talking. She saw the desert as a living body, and the figures as its veins. He believed that by studying the lines he was deciphering the heart of the earth. And somehow it was, because the Nazca lines are that, the spiritual pulse of a people who designed what felt. Today, when we fly over those figures, perhaps we not only see ancient traces but reflections of our own search. Nazca art remains a mirror, one that forces us to face our thirst of transcendence. They sought the sky with stones and steps. We look for it with telescopes and theories. But the impulse is the same, to understand who watches us when we look up. Perhaps there are no cosmic visitors, no astronaut gods, no hidden messages. Maybe there is just an old echo, the same one that makes us create, love, and seek meaning. And perhaps the real mystery of Nazca is not who drew the lines, but why we continue to feel them within us, as if they were memories engraved in sand and time. After all, the desert is just the mirror. What it reflects is the infinity that we carry in our chest. There is something about Nazca that can only be understood in silence. No theory, no matter how sophisticated, can translate what happens when the wind touches those lines. It's a type of silence that doesn't shut up. It speaks from within, a silence so old that it seems to predate language itself. From above, the desert appears unchanging, but whoever observes it with the heart realizes that there is movement there. The wind changes direction, the shadows dance, and the figures breathe in the light as if wait for someone. Maybe they're just waiting for attention, or perhaps out of understanding. Scientists continue to debate the meaning of the lines. The mystics continue searching portals and messages in them. But perhaps the truth lies elsewhere, in between, because the mystery was not made to be solved but to be felt. Nazca, in its silent vastness, seems to say that the enigma is the very bridge between the visible and the invisible, that knowledge and faith are not opposites but sides of the same search. When Maria Reich, already elderly, asked about what she discovered after half a century of studies, he only responded, "I discovered that the desert taught me to listen." Perhaps this is the closest answer to the truth. Listen to what the world says when we stop trying to decipher it. Listen to what the earth whispers when man is silent. Nazca is the portrait of this listening. Each line is a pause. Each figure, an instant of attention to the mystery that pulses behind matter. The people who created them may not have intended to defy time, and yet they did. Because when a gesture is born from the soul, it becomes eternal. Perhaps the lines do not speak of gods or ships, but of something more intimate, the desire to connect, to say we are here to the universe even without expecting a response, to affirm that human consciousness is part of the whole, and that the desert is just the mirror of our own immensity. What if the secret of Nazca is precisely this? Silence, an invitation for the mind to stop, and the soul to remember what it already knows. Perhaps the true enigma was never drawn on the ground, but within each one of us, waiting for the right moment to be remembered. The sun slowly says goodbye over the Nazca desert. The golden light touches the ground, and for an instant, the lines seem to light up, like Mo if the entire time were a single second of eternity. There, between the heat and the wind, everything that human beings have sought since the beginning seems fit. Faith, doubt, curiosity, fear, hope. Nazca is the memory of all these feelings etched in the sand. We may never find out who drew those figures, and maybe it doesn't matter, because the true meaning of a mystery is not in the answer, but in the transformation that it provokes in those who contemplate it. The Nazca lines continue to exist to remind us that the universe is bigger than our certainties, and that there are questions that we're asked to remain open. Science seeks measurements, the spirit seeks meaning, and both go hand in hand over the same desert. When archaeologists draw hypotheses and mystics close their eyes to pray, they are trying to decipher the same thing, the impulse to return home. Because deep down, every human being feels like they came from somewhere they can't name, and when looking at the sky, he seeks to rediscover this lost origin. Lines are not just ancient art. These are memories of the way back. Perhaps they were made so that one day we, travelers from a distant future, we could remember that we have spoken to infinity before, and that infinity has always responded. The desert, in this sense, is not empty. It is presence. It is the altar where the earth keeps the memory of what time has failed to erase. Nazca teaches us that the mystery does not need to be understood to be sacred, just be felt. All it takes is a deep breath in front of the horizon, a moment of silence, and something in us awakens, as if the same wind that drew those lines were blowing again through inside. And maybe, just maybe, the purpose of the lines was never to point to the sky, but remember the sky within us, because in the end, the greatest cosmic journey happens when the soul awakens to what it has always been: eternal. If this message touched something for you, subscribe and follow us. With each story, a fragment of memory lights up, and who knows, as we listen together to the silence of the desert, we might remember what Terra tries to tell us from the beginning. What if what we call the end is just the beginning of a memory that the soul has not yet forgot? What if the Nazca lines weren't messages to the gods, but answers left for us? Are we ready to understand what the universe tried to say millennia ago?